Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about how to properly care for your pet's tarantula. Tarantulas are great pets. They're relatively low maintenance. You don't need to clean their enclosure very often. They're pretty easy to feed and most of them are docile. They make great pets. But if you don't take proper care of them, they can pass away pretty quickly. So in this video, we're going to go over how to properly feed them, how big of an enclosure they need, how often you should clean their enclosure, how to properly handle them, what kind of substrate to use, how to tell if they're happy, how long they live, and many other questions that you might have regarding tarantula care. This is everything you need to know in one video. Let's get started. When you get a tarantula, there's a good chance it will come with food. The type of food that you'll usually get is roaches or crickets. And honestly, that's probably all you're going to need to feed them throughout their life. However, occasionally, you can mix things up by feeding them mealworms, waxworms, or superworms. Now, these are not staple foods, so you should only really give them these maybe once every blue moon just to add some variety into their diet. If you're interested in learning more about feeding your tarantulas, I do have another video that goes much more in depth into the topic, so feel free to check that out later. Now let's move on to enclosure size. Most people tend to overestimate how large of an enclosure they need to house their tarantulas. Now, depending on the species, they will grow to different sizes. For example, the Mexican red knee tarantula can get around 7 inches, whereas a Goliath bird-eater can get up to 12 inches. However, even the larger species do not need large enclosures. Most people think that because they're from a tropical rainforest that they need a huge enclosure to roam around in. That is false. In the wild, they actually spend majority of their time burrowed underground. Because of this, when setting up their enclosure, you want to focus more on height rather than width and length. Something else to keep in mind is that if you get a smaller enclosure, it'll allow your tarantula to climb more often. Many times you'll see people getting arboreal tarantulas and providing them with a tall enclosure, and then they end up staying on the ground. Usually this is because the walls of the enclosure are too smooth for the tarantula to climb on. So by getting a smaller enclosure, it will force your tarantula to climb more often, which is great exercise for them. A good rule of thumb is to make sure that the enclosure is at least twice as tall as your tarantula is long. Another thing to keep in mind is that you never want to use an enclosure that has a screen top. Some tarantulas like to escape through screens. Also, you don't want to use anything that has a lid with ventilation holes. Sometimes tarantulas can get stuck on the holes and end up hurting themselves. How often do I need to clean the enclosure? This is another question that I get asked all the time. The answer to this question is not very often. As long as you spot clean any uneaten food and feces, you should only have to deep clean their enclosure once or twice a year. One thing you may notice, though, is that as you spot clean their enclosure, you may notice substrate starting to build up at the bottom. If this happens, you may be wondering if you should replace the substrate. And the answer to that is no. Substrate doesn't need to be replaced unless it becomes compacted or if you notice mold growing on it. The next question I'm going to try to answer is how to properly handle your tarantula. Before you even get your tarantula, you need to understand that they are prey animals. Because of this, they are always on high alert and ready to run away. Because of this, you need to be very calm when handling them, and you never want to be rough with them. Now, every tarantula is different, and some are more docile than others. However, you never want to assume that your tarantula is calm just because it hasn't bitten you yet. The best way to handle your tarantulas is to simply observe them. All you need to do is get close to the enclosure and watch them explore the glass. If you do decide to pick them up, you want to make sure that you support their entire body and that you don't drop them. Many people have told me that they were bitten while trying to pick up their tarantula. A lot of times, this is because they try to grab the legs or the back and then accidentally crush the abdomen against the body. This will agitate the tarantula and it'll cause it to bite. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you have a female, do not pick her up right after she's molted. She's going to be very sensitive, and she could easily drop a leg or even die. Now let's talk about substrate. What type of substrate is best for tarantulas? The substrate doesn't really matter as long as it holds water and humidity well. However, I recommend using something like cocoa fiber or coconut fiber because it's a great substrate for retaining water and humidity. I've also heard of people using vermiculite, but I do not recommend using that because sometimes it's hard for tarantulas to dig in. One of the last questions I'm going to try to answer in this video is how do you tell if your tarantula is happy? There's a few ways to tell if your tarantula is happy. First off, if they're exploring their enclosure and climbing on the walls, that's a good sign. If they seem very skittish, then that means that they're most likely healthy and alert. And lastly, if they're eating regularly, then that means that they're most likely happy. The next question I'm going to try to answer is, how long do tarantulas live? The lifespan of a tarantula depends on the species and if it's a male or female. Usually females live longer than males, and some species live longer than others. For example, a Chilean rose hair tarantula can live anywhere between 25 to 30 years, whereas a Mexican red knee can live anywhere between 15 to 25 years. On average, most tarantulas live somewhere between 10 to 20 years. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. The next thing I want to mention is that this video is not sponsored by anyone. Everything that I talked about in this video is based on my own personal experience with keeping tarantulas. If you want to learn more about tarantulas, I do have a lot more videos available, so feel free to check those out. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing because it does help out a lot. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this helped a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope this helped a lot.